All right, we've gone live.
Alrighty. So, welcome chat. This is an hour on iteration. Um, since I've started speaking, I'll introduce myself. My name is George Dreyer. I'm one half of Dreyer Inc., a board game publishing group out of Portland, Oregon. I have 3 or 4 years of board game design, mostly around cards, and about 20 years of software development, which is a lot of where my experience with iteration comes from. I try to bring it to this business as well.
Hey folks, I'm Jay Treat. I've got a few published games through WizKids, Mayday, Daily Magic, and I'm passionate about iteration. I think I'm here.
My name is Matthew Orr. I'm the creative director at Wet Ink Games. So we got two inks on the call, we publish mostly role playing games, or have so far. So, but we use the same system. So, like the sort of my touch point is like publishing multiple things with the same system, but making each game different. So that's yeah. So we're gonna, whatever. That's what I'm bringing.
Very cool. So we're going to touch as many different topics as we can figure out about iteration. Let's start with when to iterate. Do either of you have immediate thoughts on that?
I mean the obvious. I mean, it's sort of a dumb answer, but it's like, when it's time to iterate, right? Like as soon, like, again, like speaking it from like a product cycle sort of thing, it's like about the time that you're done with one project, you probably already have the ideas for the next project that may have spun out of what you were currently working on. So, you had to put those aside when you were working on the current project, but then as soon as like you're done with it, then you can be like, okay, now it's time to, those things that were a germ of an idea, like now it's time to start working on those and see if they're really, quote unquote, a thing. But that point may come at all, when you've got an idea. That's when you start working on it, I guess, is what I'm saying, which is, like I said, a dumb answer.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because that is taking a view outside of a single project, whereas I was mostly looking like inside a single project. When do you iterate? But you're like, no, bigger scope. And those are both valid views. That's cool.
For me, it's usually because I've gotten sufficient feedback or looked at what's coming in, and to realize that there's something that needs changing. Basically, there's sort of identified something about this that isn't exactly as it should be, at a very high level. That is the moment to do so.
Yeah, I would say you want to iterate as fast as you can, provided that you aren't making the mistake of iterating too fast, which I would say changing something before you've gotten sufficient data to make a reasonable conclusion. That's an error that I see new game designers make, or whatever you're iterating on. You get, you're playtesting, or you don't even get to playtesting. You're just thinking about it, and you're like, oh, well, what about this? Or you see like one fail case for the thing, and you're like, well, now I'm getting rid of the thing, or I'm changing the thing. And very often one data point is not remotely enough, and you want to see the thing in action enough times to be like, no, this actually is the problem, or was it something else that was making this look like it was the problem? Because you can actually make backwards progress if you make changes too fast before you have the information you need to be sure that you're actually making progress.
Yeah, I think that when you're roughing out in the early stages of any project, when you're roughing it out, I think it's and actually there's a comment here we can show that speaks to this. Like, the earlier you are in the project, the sort of the less the stakes there are. So like you can throw an idea out and immediately throw it away and throw something else out when you're early on in the project, but there's no sunk cost yet.
Right.
But once you've gotten a game that's developed, and then like you're on your third round of playtesting and somebody's like, oh, I don't like it. Or it's like, okay, well, sorry, this is the game. This game just isn't for you. And, yeah. So I think it comes at different points in the stage when you get that more information.
For me to do that sort of quick iteration, though, I think you have to have a pretty clear idea of where you want this thing to go, where you're just going to be sort of bouncing around in a box, having equally valid or invalid possible versions of a thing. So, I mean, if you're going to iterate, I think you have to iterate in a direction. I mean, it could be we have this thing in software called like the cone of uncertainty, where like you have if you're moving towards like a final point, which is where you want to be, like you're starting in this very wide area, and like all of these could be potentially valid things. There's a lot of risk in here, and as you go, it gets narrower. But like you do want to keep it in that cone, whatever it looks like at that point. So I don't know if I'm making sense.
You're making perfect sense to me. One of the things I wanted to talk about is what not to iterate, and I would say you can iterate on everything except for whatever your current waypost is, whatever it is that is the goal that you're designing toward, and that could be, I had this idea for a game that's this mechanic plus this mechanic, or it's a game that gives this experience, or it's whatever it is, the thing that you are making decisions around in order to achieve that thing. Don't change that thing, because once literally everything is on the table for changing, you're never going to be able to make direct progress. You're just going to be swimming around in circles. Now, it is possible to be like, this waypost is bad, but I would say at that point, shelve that project entirely, make a new project for whatever this new waypost you've decided is better.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. Like that's sort of the talking about like my company we developed our own system. We call it the +1 system. It uses D6s and it uses cards. And we've done, I think we're up to 5 or so games that are in that all use that same basic system. But the point of the system is that the cards are always doing something different and the dice are always staying the same. So it's the same skill rolling process, but the cards are adding some sort of flavor every time. So if we were to, like you said, if we threw away that thing, then it wouldn't be that kind of a game anymore. It wouldn't fit into that product line anymore. So it's like, you've got to keep, I think everything else is up for grabs. Like how many skills, the tone of the game, the sort of, whether it's a dark game or a light game, as far as like tone, all of that is up for grabs. But that central thing is it uses D6s for skill rolls and it uses cards to do something else. And we give our designers like free reign to change everything else. But it keeps it, that is, like you said, the core through line through that line of games. Nice.
It leads off topic, but I have to recognize the thing that underlies what you just said is that games want to deliver both comfort and surprise, and so your players can get a new game using your system, and they know it's going to have this and this. They don't know what else it's going to have, and that gives them both the ability to access it without being like, "What the hell is all this?" and the ability to be like, "Well, what's going to be different?" to be delighted.
Right. Yeah, it's a lovely way to say it. Thank you.
I heard a quote a couple of days ago. I think just the top follows along the same lines that and this is not a talk about design, but design is the force that lives within the bounds of constraints. And I think defining those constraints allows you to continue your design, to iterate your design. But if you lose sight of the constraints, or unless you decide that those constraints were the wrong constraints, as you were saying to start with, your iteration is not going to take you to a better place for the thing you're trying to make. So how, since you brought it up as a pointer, how do you define sufficient data? And I know that's like how long is a piece of string, because each project's a bit different, but
it's a good question. It has definitely changed for me over time. As a new designer, I often needed 3 or more tests to be really confident about almost any changes. And I don't think that's a thing to be ashamed of or self-conscious about. Learning to make reasonable conclusions from your data is a skill that you build on. Whereas, now there are some things in a game that I can be like, cool, I'm halfway in a game, I can see that this is wrong. And there are some things where I still need to take 3, sometimes it's 10 games. It depends on it depends on 2 things. It depends on how squishy that idea is, how well defined it is. The less well defined it is, the harder it is to see how it's interacting with other things, and what is the actual problem, if there is a problem, what it should be doing, what it shouldn't be doing. And then the other part is dependencies. In most good game designs, as many of your systems are dependent on one another as possible. They are integrated. And so changing one thing over here could make this system that had been working not work, or vice versa, which leads into another question, which is how much to iterate each time. I'm guessing George's partner posted it, one of the comments, changing everything every time. If you do that, you're testing a new game and you're starting from zero, because you can't see, okay, if I change system A and leave systems B through C, how are those affected by the change in system A? There's going to be an effect, unless they're somehow completely siloed, which is pretty rare.
I would agree. It's under ideal conditions, you would be able to change exactly one thing, run whatever number of playtests you need, and that way you can determine, if, because that's the only thing that changed, whether that's the thing that's positively or negatively affecting the game. But I think, realistically, if you have a game that runs in 10 minutes and has a 5-minute teach, I think it's a very viable option. But if you have a game that needs 4 players, runs for 2 hours, and there's a 15-minute teach and a half hour of feedback after it, you go to a con, that's 1 playtest per session. That's probably not viable. One of the things I've done in software development, at least, to try to compartmentalize. So if I can identify the game has a bunch of subsystems, and of course they all contribute to the final result, but they, as far as mechanics, they don't overlap terribly much. I feel comfortable changing things in more than one of those, because I feel like I can identify the individual impacts in isolation, and it lets me get more out of less playtests, in a sense. It's not always perfect, but it's we rarely have the opportunity to run 100 iterations on or 100 playtests on a mechanism and find out whether that was better or worse.
Sure. It's it's so different working in role-playing games. Role-playing games are because they're so much more from the player. They're so much more squishy, I guess. And you would never. Well, I mean, you might play test something 100 times, but there's a lot more forgiveness on the RPG side, where you're expecting the player to fill in all the gaps that you didn't think about anyway. Even in the best role-playing games, not everything is stated in the rules, because people who play role-playing games are adding themselves, they're doing a lot of the work. So it's much harder, I imagine, to design a resource management, worker placement, guys on a map kind of game.
I think we should take a few minutes to dive into the difference between designing for and iterating for squishy things like RPGs and less squishy things like board games. But before we jump into that, I first want to I just want to reiterate what George said, because it was so on point. Ideally, you only ever change one thing at a time. That is absolutely the ideal, because that's going to give you the least corrupted data, the most. But time constraints are super real. The amount of time you have between tests makes a huge difference. A lot of designers are in situations where they're lucky if they get to test once a month with a game design club or something like that. And if you've got a month between tests and you're trying to get something out in less than 5 years, then you're going to have to concede some certainty in order to try to keep up pace. And again, that's not ideal, but it's something you're going to have to do in those situations.
Right.
I also want to hit on this iteration on the fly comment. And I would say never iterate mid-game unless the rest of the game will not be useful information for you because something is that messed up. That would be my rule. Because you haven't had time to consider the change beforehand, and so you could be making the situation worse. But B, it makes it really hard to make reasonable conclusions about what was working and what is working and what isn't working, because what happened earlier in the game affects what's happening now in the game. It just gets really messy. Do either of you have opinions on iterating mid-game?
Do you want to go, Matt, and I'll follow?
I think it depends on. I think it comes from my experience with the squishy side of it again, where it's like I've been doing these game jams at conventions for the last few months, where I get together with some people and we're like, okay, here's a bunch of components on the table. Let's make a game real quick, and they're like. That is the activity, is to like we've been doing this for 5 minutes and it doesn't seem promising. Let's throw it all away and start over, because, but that's a very specific context, and sort of like producing a video where other people are watching this design process happen live is the content, right? So it is good in that context. And I think, what you said about like you do earlier on in the design process, we had another question here from, about like when to do with a chainsaw, when to do with a scalpel. And I think that depends on when in the design process you're at. Earlier on, the first time you've written down a rule sheet, you're getting players together for the first time. Let's see how this works. And then somebody throws out a question that like you never considered, and everybody's in agreement that like this other way that this person who you didn't invite them to contribute to the game, and yet now they're got everyone at the table on their side about how it should be different already, and you haven't even played the game yet. Yeah, great. Go with that because you didn't foresee it, and the people are already iterating there. But again, if you're in like stage 3 of the playtest and you've got a full sheet of rules and there's a whole not character backstory, but like a world that you're putting this game into, if somebody is taking it off on the rails, it's like that's one failed playtest, and yes, that's a different game. That's a project for the future. That's not how this game works. You can be more confident in your design later on, but earlier on, I think big swings are fine because you're still kind of trying to find what the game is earlier on.
Yeah, I'm much along the same lines. I think if it's early on and you're painting with broad brush strokes, you're trying to really flesh out where this is. You have a concept, but it's all pretty nebulous. And you set the expectation for the people who sat down at the table beforehand that we are going to be playing around with what's going to go on here. We're going to play a few rounds. Something doesn't feel right. We're going to try something else, with the understanding that you're not going to get concrete data about like what needs to iterate, but you're going to get, again, with that cone of uncertainty, you're going to get a direction out of this. I want to turn that on its head slightly, though, and say, like, and this is not a panel about playtesting, but you also don't have to play the whole game. Like, you can start in media res and like play 5 or 6 rounds with a situation that you've crafted, maybe because you've recorded notes from a previous one and been like, all right, I've seen a board game get to this state and weird things happen, so I'm just going to set that up. I film a lot of my playtests. I know I'm not very methodical about resetting up the scenarios, but I really want to get better at that this year because it would save a lot of time getting there. And that, again, if you have a large game that requires a lot of people, you may be able to get a few more iterations or a few more playtests in to inform that iteration if you can isolate the section of the mid game or the mid to late game, that's where you're having problems. So that's one way to, if you're gonna change things in your game, you can just take that section and not worry about what came before, what came after, and see if you can work on that transition or something of that nature.
You can also sometimes do a vertical slice instead of what you were describing, a horizontal slice, where you say, I'm going to test just this system. I'm literally going to take just this system, get rid of the rest of the game, and just test this. It's in board games, it's not usually super feasible because usually you need one to make the other work. But in a complex system, and particularly in video games or developed systems like software, where it takes so much time to build the whole thing, it's just cheaper to like let's just try this. You can test just the one thing, see how that works, understand how it works, and then once you're happy with it, integrate it to the larger whole.
I actually have a project that I was supposed to get to last night and just didn't get a chance, but with a game where we were having some problems with like a UX readability sort of thing, where people are having difficulty because it's a game where you position things and you're finding patterns, and there's other rules around it, but because the UX thing is the problem, I wanted to run a playtest where I'm just going to strip all of the other rules, and all people have to do is identify the patterns, and I'm just going to time them and see, and then get feedback on how easily, like, how do they feel about those sorts of things. I'm not really worried about the rules or about the final state of the game. I just want to see whether we're making progress on that particular aspect, because the rest doesn't really matter if people can't read the cards, So yeah, that's a concrete example of that vertical slicing.
Nice. So we're already kind of talking about this. So let's dive in. What to focus on when, and this is kind of talking about the process. So I just threw this together. I'm not saying this is final. I might even change it myself, but I would say that initially, when you're testing an idea, you're literally just trying to figure out what the direction actually is. Like, you've got one idea, maybe two ideas, and you just want to see, if I put this out here, what does it feel like? What is the experience like? So that you can say, this is what's working, this isn't what's working, this is what I want to pursue. And then after that, once you've decided, okay, this is what I want to go for, then you're worrying about the execution. How does it work? How does it play? Once you've figured out that, you're then looking at the details. And then only once you've got all that in place are you ever looking at balance. Balance should be like way near the end. If you're ever looking at balance early, you're wasting your time. Although like super imbalanced things will throw off a playtest and make things look bad that don't have to be bad if they were balanced different. So it's not 100% irrelevant. But definitely, like, don't fine tune balance, just rough balance. And then last would be like editing. Like, let's just literally get our words and graphic design right before it's published.
Right.
Do you guys have different takes on any of that?
The only thing that I would add from a more role-playing game perspective is that, I mean, there are mechanics, right? There's, if you use a deck of cards and you've got two jokers in, there's certain percentages that there are of how many types of cards or whatever. I mean, there are numbers to these things, but because role-playing is bringing in such storytelling elements, you have to tie effectively, like, what are you iterating, right? Do people believe, or do they buy into those storytelling elements being governed by those pieces of math? Like, that's sort of more where you're adjusting things, where it's like, okay, so if we say it's, I don't know, I'm trying to make a game up off the top of my head, but like, let me use an example from one of my games. We have a game called Heckin' Good Doggos, and you're playing dogs, and the dogs are just regular old dogs running around the neighborhood doing things, right? And so in that game, we wanted to make it sort of like, fairness is kind of where I'm leading to, where it's like, you've got your actions, the things your dogs can do to resolve conflicts are based on the hand of cards that you have. And so the 4 suits are the 4 ways that the dog can try and solve the problem, right? And so in theory, any dog could do anything at any time, but like, we're saying that the game is limited to the actions that you have in your hand. Like, I'm going to play 3 hearts and I'm going to give him puppy dog eyes, and that's going to solve this problem in this moment. But because it's a light game, the thing that we added is like, then you get to refill your hand, and then now you have maybe the same options, maybe you have different options. It's not about the scarce resources of the cards, because it's a light, friendly, dogs doing dog stuff kind of game. And so the mechanics of the math of how many hearts there are versus how many spades you're likely to have in your hand, that's not a super heavy decision-making process. It's like, here's the thing I can do now. I do it, and then I draw more cards, and we move on with the moment. And that's just one solution for one specific thing. But like, the idea is that, like, in a, I don't know, knights fighting dragons and the skies are always thunderstorms kind of game, that wouldn't be as appropriate of a rule set to tie to those themes, because you would want more choice and like dourness about, like, I play this single card to do this massive action, you know, that like it costs me part of my soul or whatever, you know. It's, you're bringing in all of these like feelings into the mechanics when you're doing role-playing games. And so that's a whole other set of balance things that don't necessarily have to do with the math. And that's what when you're saying it doesn't work, it's not working when I'm play testing this. It's like more about the feelings than the iteration of how many places, how many worker placement spots there are in this section of the board or whatever. I don't know. It just I don't know, adding to the things to think about, I guess, or different things to think about.
I think it's just a different look of the same concept. Whether I, in this worker placement game, feel like being able to go here and not being able to go here fits the story and the experience and the puzzle of what I'm doing, isn't like, it looks really different from what you just described, but I think it's, in the end, it can be boiled down the same way. Do I buy that my dog can only do loving things right now and not bark its way out of this? Is that a satisfying puzzle to solve? Yeah, one's numbers and one is not numbers, but I think the end result is, you know, are we giving the player the best experience they can?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the thing in common is that all games have an arc. So there is a progression towards some sort of conclusion, and hopefully it is not a flat line, because that's not terribly fun for anyone, or an angle down. You know, so there's generally a rising action, a climax, and a completion to any given story. And I think you tell a story in pretty much every game in some form. I mean, I suppose you could say in a purely abstract one you wouldn't, but that's not. No, even then, there is a progression of events, hopefully in a not purely linear fashion, that leads to some sort of conclusion. And I think that is common. I think that's probably, I am terrible at focusing on systems before the arc, always to my detriment when I allow myself to do that. Like, as you're saying, the experience is what matters for the people, and then you can fix the underlying mechanisms that tell that story when you find problems with them. But if there isn't an arc to the game, then I think that's probably what needs to be iterated first.
Yeah, I'd say that's part of the direction and maybe part of the execution, depending on, you know. We've got a relevant comment that I want to address here, and that's, you know, being willing to iterate, being willing to recognize that your game isn't perfect. That's definitely, ego is both necessary and dangerous in any creative process. If you don't have any ego, then you're not going to bother, because you're not going to be like, this is an idea that's worth spending time on. But ego really easily gets in the way of making the thing better. My solution for that is I like to put my ego into the process of the game design rather than the game design itself, because then I can always justify making changes to the game design that make it better, because I'm being proud of the process of making the game better rather than what it is right now. That's my kind of mind trick to get around that. But yeah, you have to be willing, not just willing, you have to be eager to iterate on every part of your game that isn't that central waypost, so that you can make it better.
Yeah. I mean, there is something to be said for like a sort of like auteur. I made this game and it works exactly this way and it's perfectly the game that I want to make, and then you have to like enter into that world of that person's mind and it works that way. But you also want to get lots of people to play and enjoy your game more. Well, you don't necessarily want to, but like that is often the goal of making games, is to get more than like the 3 people who think exactly like you to play it. Being the phrase that hasn't come up in the comments yet, it's often used, is kill your darlings. And that is the I loved this subsystem, I loved these NPCs, I loved this thing that the game was doing, and it's like, but nobody else likes it, it doesn't fit now that the game has progressed to this stage, and it hurts me a little bit to cut it out, but it will make the product, it will make the completed process of playing the game better. So, you know, get used to that feeling of like,
and that doesn't mean that thing that you are removing from this game has no place in the world. It just means it probably doesn't have a place in this thing you're building, at least not in its current state. And that leads me to something that I think fits into this particular bullet point of our conversation, which is how you record what you retain from previous iterations. So like I'm, again, from the software background, very methodical about like, I build everything in spreadsheets for my cards and that sort of thing. And anytime I'm making a change, I hope, sometimes I'm sloppy with this, like I copy the spreadsheet over and then I make the modifications there. So I have a full history, because sometimes I go back to versions of games that I liked because I've gone off in the wrong direction and I have to circle back. Like, are either of you that sort of, do you keep versions?
Yeah, because if you're not keeping stuff, then that means trying something is burning everything behind you, and that means that you have to have some confidence in that thing. Whereas if you know you can always revert, then you can try anything. You're free to try anything, which is just going to get you more places.
Yeah, there's definitely. It's probably not as clearly. I could find it. I could find old versions of things and go backwards, but I could keep better notes about that kind of stuff. But I like that idea of like, this game got to 60% done and then there's a branch point, right? And then we went off and finished it here. But then if I go back to that 60% version, I can go in a different direction and make a different game, and it'll end up at a different point and it'll be a different thing. But like, and that's kind of the idea behind having like a standard rules document, which is something that a lot of, any RPG, and not any RPG, but like I'm thinking of like the Mutant Year Zero engine that Free League puts out. It's like, here's the standard rules document. This is how these kind of games work. Make your own attachments to it to make it your game. But the core is this works this way. And that's kind of a similar idea to what you're talking about like, the stuff that we know works is here and that doesn't change. But then we take it to these different directions and hit on these different notes.
So for me, a lot of game design is exploring what the design space is, trying to understand and discover the boundaries of what is and isn't this design. And so I will actively try things that I expect to fail because I want to see how they fail, or if I'm wrong and they won't fail, because I'm going to learn more about where the boundaries are, where I should be pushing and where I shouldn't be. And I know I'll just, go back to not doing that if I was right. I wanted to say 2 more things about the earlier stuff. One is, if you've ever built a magic deck around a card, you're like, this is an exciting card, I'm going to build a deck around this. For me, 95% of the time, that deck ends up cutting that card because the thing that I discovered building around it was better than the thing in itself. And that's a really good analogy, I think, for game design. That happens all the time. You're like, this is an idea. I'm building around this idea. I'm seeing what works. This works great. I no longer need that initial thing. This thing's better. And then the other thought was, art is not a thing that an artist can like put out in the world and it just exists on its own. Art doesn't exist without the audience. And what it is depends on both the creator and the audience. And it is very much that for game design. No matter how perfect I think the game is, it means nothing without other people to play it. And how they play it defines what the game actually is. So if I don't understand how the audience is going to interact with the thing that I made, I don't understand the thing that I made.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that that makes me think of many things that I don't know are strictly germane to this conversation. So there's a comment here from Dreyer Inc. that I think would be good to address. I don't remember how to do the put it on the screen thing. Did you just click on? No, I was the one from a few up about that one. The timeline between iterations and how like, you work on something and then you let it sit and don't work on it for a little while to kind of give your brain the space to see whether or not you did a good job or not.
Relevant.
I that's a really important idea and an important question. And ideally, we said this word earlier, you would have that time to be like, all right, I got it to this stage. Here's the rules. I'm going to let that set aside for a little while, and then I'll look at it again in 2 weeks and see if I still like the way it is. And then if I do, then it's ready for other people to look at. Often, again, production line schedules, and you've only got so much time, and like you're often writing things up to the last minute, and you don't necessarily have that time to let things lay aside. But it is a way that I like to work. I like to have, okay, I'm going to finish this by this date and then not work on it for a while so that I can work on something else. And then I come back to the first thing and then I move it to the next stage because, often it's just fatigue, right? I've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about these exact things. Often with the role playing, you've got like more like, we've done history based games. So there's like, I got to keep all that events of real world stuff in mind as well. And how does that all integrate? And then like, I just need to not think about that for a little while. No more productive work is coming out of this area for the next whatever time, so set it aside, do something else. But sometimes you have to finish it by this date and then you just got to keep working until it's done. So
most of my published games have sat on a shelf for years while I worked on other things. Then I came back. It can be really, really helpful to just be like, I'm not sure what to do with this next. Set it aside until I have an idea on it again and work on something else. This is one of those things that you can too much and too little. We creatives often get distracted by the shiny new thing, and it's really easy to say, I've got this brand new idea. I'm going to stop working on what I'm working on and start working on that. And if you do that too much, you never finish anything. So that's the too much. You have to have some amount of like, I'm actually trying to push this to completion. But it's also great to take breaks, like you said, whether they're short like yours or long like mine. And if you never take breaks, then you can just get totally stuck.
Yeah.
I sort of sit in between. Anytime I have a playtest, like I record, obviously I'm recording what they said and that sort of thing. And I write up probably within 24 hours, like anything I feel like issues that were raised as a result of that. And probably one possible solution, which has about a 2% chance of surviving to be the actual solution. Like generally the solution I think of on the day is way too influenced by what the playtesters were saying they think the solution should be, which is generally a terrible idea. And I think the previous lecture conversation covered that pretty much in detail. But yeah, and then I will have ideas over the next week or so if I can allow myself that time. That I'll just start listing until I think I've got a reasonable set of things that are actually worth trying. But yeah, having that time to percolate generally gives me a better result if I have the luxury to do so.
Yeah. I have to share this procrastination is really funny. I'm guessing that's the like starting the next idea immediately all the time. It's pretty funny.
I took it more like who has, you know, like how many unfinished, like, oh, I've done with this piece of embroidery, I just have to do the border, but I'm going to do this whole other scarf first, and like it just, the craft projects just lay around. Or model painting, how many people have like left their bases to the end and then never got back to them? I don't know.
One good reason to step away sometimes is that it's pretty easy and common to get designer blindness, where you're either so thick in the weeds or you're so used to playing the game that you don't see how complicated it is. You don't see how difficult it is for new players, or you've just forgotten. You've lost some perspective. Like this is a huge deal in development of games, in balancing games, because the people who are balancing it play it over and over again, and they inherently get really, really good at it. And it's not always obvious when you and everyone who's playing is really good at a game, and you lose sight of the fact that you're now balancing for expert players and not beginning players. That kind of thing.
No, that's a real thing. You've got to play test outside of your own circle at some point in the process. Ideally.
Absolutely. And that ties into, you want to be testing not just with different audiences, like in terms of demographics, but you want to be testing with designers and non-designers. You want to be testing with hardcore gamers and casual gamers, because they all have different starting points to consume your game from, and they all have different goals to consume your game with. And if you're not trying to design just for hardcore game designers, which is a really small audience, you got to see how other groups play it.
Yeah.
I'd love to address Numpub's comment there, because I think we may have different approaches. I like starting with a seed. Every game is a theme, but I like to start with a seed mechanism and add things onto it as I feel like that thing isn't going to immediately have its wheels fall off. So I generally start with, even if the core thing is fairly large, it's still contained, and then I will patch things onto it as I feel like it can support them.
Yeah, I think inevitably for me, you start with a small amount and then you add on too much, and then you have to cut back a little bit. And so, you know, the early stage of a project, when, I mean, I think it was you, Jay, mentioned like finding the parameters of what this project is. Like when you're starting out, you don't know what those are, and so you can go everywhere. You know, like, oh, maybe it'll have this and this and this and this and this, and then you start to rein in what this game is, and you realize that some of those ideas are outside of this project. And you know, so again, you get bigger and then you get smaller again, but not as small as you started. That's how I typically work.
I tend to do the opposite, and I'm not sure that it's right. I like the fail first philosophy. So it's like, let's try a bunch of things, see which one works, cut the others, and then pursue that. The issue with that is I'm doing more design up front before I'm getting my first play test, and B, that experience is always overwhelming to the play testers, and that colors the data.
I suppose the negative counterpoint I found to my approach is that because I'm working in a fairly narrow constraint, I'm ignoring things that I really should potentially consider early on in the process, and then I have to backtrack if I'm finding that I've gone, you know, a mile down a road and this is not the right path. Whereas I imagine you considering a lot of things early, you you may have a lot more you have to discard, but at least you have you can coalesce quicker to a good idea potentially if you didn't hit the first mark on the way out. I'm curious how you do a few playtests. You see a number of things that you might want to iterate on. Like, how do you triage those? Like, I tend to make rules changes before asset changes, just because it's cheaper and easier, even if the asset change might be a slightly smarter one. I lean in on the side of efficiency. I don't know if that's a good idea. May not be, but do you have a similar sort of way to hierarchically decide what to change next?
Certainly, if there's a thing that would eventually be an asset change, that I can just be like, okay, for this test, I'm going to say that this is the case, and we're not actually going to change it. Especially if I'm low confidence about it. Hell yeah, because that just means that I haven't spent an hour to 4 hours changing all these assets, tried the thing and say, oh, it didn't work. And you can just say, no, imagine all these costs are +1. But other than that, I think I would be trying to predict which would be the final solution. And usually that's if I can make something that's an asset change. So unless the change is making a rule simpler or smaller or gone, I'd rather make an asset change than a new rule.
Okay.
I like that. I think talking about assets is something that another form of iteration that I have in mind, and I think it relates to a comment from Jam House Media or JMA House Media here. We've talked some of this about like bigger changes earlier in the process versus changes later in the process, and I think there's another question here too from talking about like playtest materials specifically. I think. I don't see it. Oh yeah, it's from Dryer Inc. But so I'm going to transition and talk about iteration another way, but like taking this talk about playtesting and what you cut and what you don't. You should not make, quote unquote, whatever you could do, whatever process works for you, do it. But like ideally, your first playtest is not going to be like you're not going to commission art and make cards for a playtest like that. If you're still at the playtesting stage, and it's something that we mentioned a while ago was expectations, player expectations. Like, this is a playtest. This is a very rough design. This is the first time this is out on the table. And also so match those expectations with the physical materials, right? So if you've got handwritten notes on 3x5 cards, and some standard dice that you pulled from a standard collection of dice, and you tell people this is the first time this game has ever been played, all of the materials match. If you put on the table, I got this art from this artist, and this is the art that we're definitely going to be using in the game, and here's the neoprene playmat where we're going to put down the 3 sections of the board, and it's the first time this game has ever been played. That is a mismatch of like your investment in the prototype and the expectations of the players, because once you're at the stage of commissioning the materials that are physically going to be part of the game, you shouldn't do that until you know pretty well what the game is going to be. And then you might still in the late stage realize that like, okay, we need to print +1 on all of these tokens, so we have to redesign that token sheet or something like that. But that's a relatively minor change relative to whatever. I mean, match your playtest materials to how done the game is, and that helps with that investment thing, and it helps with that cone of uncertainty that you talked about, the narrowing down. Like when you're at the scalpel stage, to hit on something that one of the commenters said earlier, that's when you can print some playtest materials that are more professional looking at that stage, because you're not going to change those things. You're at the like fine tuning the words on the card. You're at the stage of like making sure the rule book accounts for everything. Those are late stage changes that should be scalpel sized, and the materials that you're playtesting with or that you're using at that stage should reflect that, right? This is a pretty much done. We know there's going to be, here's a play mat that we know we're going to put these 3 things on the table. Anyway, don't overinvest early on in those physical things. And this isn't a pitch, how to get your game pitched. This isn't that either, but that's the same sort of thing where, you don't have to have a game that looks like it's professionally printed to pitch it to a company that, you can, but you don't have to. You don't have to. Anyway, so those are some thoughts that I was having reading some of these comments.
If you show commissioned art to a publisher in a pitch meeting, that will actively turn most of them off, because A, that shows that you don't know what you're doing because you put money where you shouldn't have, and B, it says that you're going to be hard to work with because you've already decided on the theme and they can't retheme it, which is something publishers like to be able to do.
Right. I have one comment on the writing up cards and that sort of thing. So part of my earliest iterations, because I tend to build everything digitally and then print them, is laying out the very rough, probably not going to survive, but graphic design on the cards. Because I work so much with cards, I'll inevitably think that I can put these 7 traits on this card. At least I have this bigger picture of what I want to do, and I start laying out the card, and I quickly realize like this is just not parsable. And now I have to treat it like what really does this game need in order to communicate what I wanted to communicate, and I'll winnow that down through a number of versions. And the other reason I invest the time there is because I find it helps me iterate quicker later on if I'm building things in a digital format first. And if you're not comfortable with that, that's a different matter. But and some people just are paper and pen fast, and I am absolutely not. But having templates that I can quickly alter let me crank things out quite quickly. But it's really that initial, like, I think in my head I can picture a card and it can fit all this stuff, and then I actually lay it out in the real size. I'm like, I'm gonna 11mm cubes are the standard size, so I'm gonna make a little square. Oh wow, no, this is just a mess, kind of thing. And it lets me, before I even get it to a table, get a general feel for what the game can handle. But that's just, it may just be specific to what I'm doing.
Yeah, graphic design for readability, for legibility, for usability is really the only thing that I would spend a lot of cycles on before I'm like at the point where I'm like, this game is done, because that really affects play.
Yeah. I know this is kind of a different direction. I kind of want to throw out a couple thoughts here about iterating, because we talked about theme, we talked about commissioning assets, we talked about, you're talking about UX just now. And you mentioned, like, again, not a pitch meeting, but like selling your game to a company, or in my case, I am the publisher. So like you get to revisit the theme of the game several times, right? So I talked earlier about like making the mechanics match the feeling of the game. Then you commission art and like, okay, so the game feels like this. We already know that. So this is what we want the art to look like. And then you have a layout process where you're like, okay, layout, graphic design people, we need a logo that fits that. We need a not a logo. It's like a typeface, but a title treatment. That's the term I'm searching for. A title treatment that says the name of the game in a style that immediately conveys the theme that we've been building in throughout the whole thing. And the graphic design, the layout. Are we going to use what fonts are we going to use? How, all of those things are different. It is iterating on the same theme, or like layering in the same message, so that you get a box that looks immediately on the shelf like it's going to be a certain sort of thing. And then you take it open and you see the materials and they look like they're going to give that same experience. And then you read the rules and you find out that it's trying to give that same experience. And then you play it and, oh, it does give that experience. Like, there were no lies. It was all, so, I mean, that's a very long part of the process besides the game, but you get to revisit that, iterating, but in like a way that focuses, right, and redoubles each other, where all the pieces are working in consort together, from design to layout to the art to the marketing. Like, all of that stuff is also a way to revisit the theme over and over again.
And theme is a functional part of the game. You can have two games that have exactly the same rules, exactly the same numbers and stats, if they've got different words and different looks, they're functionally different experiences, and graphic design is a huge part of that. So
Yeah,
graphic design
absolutely.
is part of the game.
I think kind of sort of tie us to what we were thinking of closing on, which is when do you stop iterating? Which is with a software product that can go through beta and we can push updates out. I mean, we can say I would say when your changes are more likely to make things worse than better. But I think that's a little too early for something that you can't send out updates for. And I think it's part that, because obviously you don't want to be changing something for the worse, but it's also when the changes you would make would just make it into something different. And as soon as that's the kind of change you're trying to make, like those are the only changes that are left to you, then the thing that you have is probably okay. I guess that's the point to start the discussion.
I think I like that. Like, again, using the scalpel analogy, like if you're down to the point where you're like, is this monster better if it's has 3 strength versus 4 strength? Like, does it matter? Like, it's done. You don't need to fiddle with it anymore. Like you usually can get a feel of when it's done. Like, if there's just this problem never really got fixed, but you know what, it's 0.5% of the total text of this game, and it's fine. It's fine. I can't.
Done is a very strong argument, as I've heard others say.
Yeah. I honestly believe that you could iterate forever on anything, because you're always going to find a few things to change. So for me, the rule is, this isn't helpful, but when the number of iterations you made last time is below your polish threshold level, how polished do you need the game to be? And for some games, that's going to be like, well, I only changed 4 words. Close enough, we're done.
Yeah.
And for some people, it's going to be like, this needs to ship. It doesn't matter where it's at. It's done.
Well, yeah. That, again, those realities of the business side of this. Yeah.
Let's circle back to let's circle back to RPGs versus board games. At a high level, how is it different to design them and iterate them? High level.
I feel like I've had a lot to say about that already. So let either of you said you work in both earlier, fine. Jay. So
I do have words. So for me, you're in both cases, you're looking at what is the thing that is common between them is, what is the scope of possibility? What are the bounds of play? In a board game, it's, you can take these 3 actions this turn, and over the course of the game, you can pursue these different strategies based on these cards that you took, or these or whatever. And in an RPG, the actions that you give players defines the scope of possibilities that they can have, and that's really all you can do, because what the players choose is what makes the actual experience. So in board games, it's more constrained, but the way that you can fail is by giving them options that they'll never take, and so those are just kind of like wasting space. In an RPG, it's okay, are you saying you just say what you do on your turn and you can do anything, or are you saying you've got 4 suits of cards and they tell you what type of action you can take? Or are you saying you can try any of the abilities listed on your character sheet and you roll? Are you saying in this game there is no attack, there is no combat, this is a talking game, this is a game about this? You set the scope of possibilities, because within that, players can do so many different things. All you can do is say, these are the things you can do, or this is the range of things you can do.
Yeah. I think we might need another conversation, another hour for a response, because we're down to 30 seconds left in this conversation today. Okay. I like what you're saying. I think there's much to respond to, but yes, the constraints are different. But I think they're not that dissimilar, like as what you were saying earlier. Because obviously board games set constraints of all kinds, you know. Yeah.
It's
Last
been great
seconds to you,
chatting with
George.
you guys.
I haven't worked in design or role playing games. I would love to hear, I guess, in another topic, like how you decide whether to resolve an issue via rules that affect the players or via basically assist you gave to the person who adjudicates the game, whoever's sitting at the head of the table. Because I meant that you have that mechanism that we don't have in board games. And that would, I think, would be
there's stuff like well, anyway, like the Overlord in Descent, you know, like is playing on some of that. So it exists. I think there's not a hard line between the two. That's what I'm. Yeah.
fair enough.
Well, if we iterate on this panel, maybe we would have more space for this topic. But thank you to all of our viewers, and thank you to Unpub for putting this all together. We're done. We're done. We're out of time.
Thank you.